Hi, this is Dr. Erica Lewis, and I'm here to discuss with you interviewing for empathy. Now, many of you are quite familiar with interviewing, so we're going to build on what you already know. I still remember my class from undergraduate where I learned about interviewing, and we all sat in a circle around probably my teacher's grandma or someone and learned how to ask questions that were sensitive and how to structure the way we ask questions. So I know that you all know so much of that and can leverage a depth of experience about talking to humans. So we're not going to review some of the basics that I would have reviewed if I was teaching this class with undergrads. I know you bring a lot of advanced skills in things like motivational interviewing and talking to people about challenging things. So we'll just leverage all of that and specifically focus on here about how we can interview using the empathy-based framework. So this is the arc of an interview that you see on the slide here. And this kind of aligns with things that you've likely learned already, that you start with a introduction of yourself and introduction of the project. And when you do that, I find it's helpful to say a little bit about your why and to think before you go into the interview about why you want to do this interview beyond just that you have a class assignment that requires it. So why are you interested in this? Why are you invested in it? Why do you care? And if you can start the interview by saying briefly what that is, that can start that building of rapport. And as you build rapport with someone, you might not be even asking questions that you need for the interview. You're having some conversation about who they are and what they're interested in and their life, and sharing about yourself so that you can get into the more personal aspects once you do begin asking questions. We're trying to get at the deeper needs that are present for people in situations where there's an obvious need. And to get at those deeper needs, you need that rapport. So that's an important aspect. And interestingly enough, even skilled clinicians, and in fact, actually sometimes especially skilled clinicians and leaders, skip this step. We become so focused on being efficient in healthcare that we walk into the room sometimes and we ask what we need to know and we leave instead of creating this conversation. And that's not what interviewing for empathy is about. Interviewing for empathy is about taking the time, giving time and space to build the rapport before getting into the conversation. So make sure you do that during your interviews. Then your questions begin, and you usually begin with questions that are less sensitive, just like when we do interviewing about health history and things. And our focus is on trying to evoke stories. So asking questions that get at the whole bigger, intricate picture of what's going on. So as you're creating your questions, I'll have some more advice through this lecture on that, but think about how to ask questions that get at stories. As you get at stories, those are going to most likely show some underlying emotions. And another strategy we'll talk about in this lecture is how to explore those emotions. And then as you're wrapping up the interview, that's a good time to ask those clarifying questions. So making sure you understood things correctly, clarifying any of the observations you had that you want validated by the participant, and then thanking them and wrapping up. So this is the arc of the interview from Stanford D-School. So IDEO is the for-profit branch of Stanford's D-School, and you'll hear me talk about Stanford's D-School in this class. That's where I did my training on innovation. So a lot of my tools came from that training. And I did a week-long kind of intensive there and then continued with a group of educators online to refine those skills over the course of the last several years. So a lot of the materials I have to offer do kind of come from their stuff, and I've adapted them to work with health providers and health leaders. So one of the interesting things about working with health leaders in the design space is that we have this complex relationship with intuition. And we often say, if we're justifying how we knew something, that you had some intuition about it. Or maybe not often, but it happens. And when I've done a lot of reading about intuition, I'm super interested in it. And what I find is that the person is actually describing a set of observations they had and some reasoning that was so deep in their brain that it happened unconsciously. And this has been shown with functional MRIs to be the case. So what happens when someone says they're intuiting something is that they're actually thinking about it so complexly that they're not even aware. And when you ask people to like spell out what they were actually thinking, when they tell you that they use their intuition, you'll often get at observations. So, for example, there's an interesting story in a book about a nurse who had an intuitive response to a child in the NICU. But as the interviewers kind of encouraged her to share further, they learned that she did notice like this slight change in the baby's abdomen and skin tone and things like that. And then she used her history and background knowledge of that person, that patient, and then also clinical knowledge to understand that something was going wrong, even though she couldn't fully spell out why or what was happening, and ultimately ended up making a big difference in the care of that patient. So we've had those experiences, and I feel that as clinicians, sometimes we brush off our intuition and don't take the time to stop and realize that it is actually a complex thought process. One of the ways to do that, and you can practice it during your empathy interviews, is to become more cognizant of your observations. And observations are a big part of design thinking, so I'd like to focus on them specifically and some strategies for how to use them in the empathy-based framework. Observations that you're looking for in your interviews are things that prompt behavior. So you can do this actually outside of an interview too. You can just sit and watch people. That's a little bit hard with the question we have, but if we were working on, let's say, a transportation problem, I'd probably ask you to go ride the bus and just observe what's going on, or something like that. But you want to watch what prompts people to do things, especially workarounds. So where you see a workaround, that's often a problem that someone hasn't articulated. So if in an interview, even articulated to themselves, someone says, oh, well, we do it this way, but I solved that problem by blah, blah, blah. Right there, you want to pay attention. You want to lean in and ask more questions to that, because that's illustrating that there's a problem with the we do it this way. So those adaptations that people make or workarounds are something you want to pay attention to. You can tell when you're talking to someone what they care about, and that's something that you want to observe. You can observe that through body language. You can observe that through how they speak, their speech pattern. And so what people care about is ultimately what you're getting at in these interviews. And those are spots where you want to lean in. When you hear what someone cares about and they're maybe not even fully articulating it, that's a spot you want to ask additional questions. And when you observe that, and that body language is one way to observe that. So patterns and themes, when we're looking for a good problem to work on, which is essentially what we're doing right now in our interviews. When you begin interviewing for empathy, your early interviews are just understanding the problem. Now, you've been told the problem, but you already know that we oversimplify that complex problem, and your first job is to understand the real problem, the complex problem, the aspects of it that aren't yet clear. And that's what's going to allow us to create solutions that we wouldn't have otherwise. So you're looking for these patterns and themes from people when you're trying to investigate the problem, what the problem is. So if you talk to 3 people and they all say the same thing, well, that's where you want to keep asking more about and learning more about. And then when you're trying to create solutions, you look more at the extremes or what's unexpected and out of place. So if 3 people tell you this is a problem and the 4th says, oh, that doesn't bother me at all, maybe that's just people's personalities, or maybe that person has an adaptation that gets them around the problem that if you investigate a little bit, you'll learn more. So these are some of the observations you want to make. You can take notes on this during your interviews because it can be hard to remember some of this afterwards. So taking notes on your observations during your interviews will help you to do well with interviewing for empathy. So you already know a lot about listening, and we'll leverage some of what you know here and build on it. You've all heard of active listening, right? So let's think about what we're actually doing when we actively listen. Many times we're active in ourselves still. So we're trying to listen, but we're thinking ahead about the question we want to ask. We're thinking ahead about our reaction to what's being said. And active listening becomes then less about the listening part and more about the active on our side part. So we're going to practice in our interviews for empathy something called other focused listening. And I encourage you to practice outside of your interviews the skill also. This is a challenging skill to do, and it can feel a little clunky at first. So if you can practice it before your interview, that will be ideal. The first thing I'll recommend is a 5-second pause. Now, a 5-second pause is a long pause. And it's simple in that when the person stops speaking, you wait a full 5 seconds before you say anything else. I usually try to count 1, 2, 3, and somewhere in around there, between the 3 and the 4, I start thinking about the next question I want to ask. So I've given a little bit of space where I'm not even active in any way. People think they do this, and they think they let folks fully speak, and they do not. So this is a really challenging thing to do. It can feel like a long time. And what I find is that folks will fill this space. So if you give that 5-second pause, the person you're talking to often will fill that space. And they'll tend to take the conversation more in the direction they want to, or elaborate in a way that they wouldn't have otherwise because of that pause. I've had students try this and say, it's changed relationships they had, that it has really helped them through conflict. So this 5-second pause is a thing, and I want you to give that a whirl during your interviews and maybe some practice beforehand. So you likely know about reflections, and I posted a reading or a paper for you to read in our module on more complex reflections, which many of you have used as part of motivational interviewing. Complex reflections can be used as part of empathy-based interviewing also, and you can use those as you would normally, like during a motivational interview. So look over that list in the module and see what you're comfortable with and try using some of those skills in this setting. The one thing that you can do that is slightly different in an interview for empathy is that as you have those observations, you can use your reflections to test those out, to validate those with your interviewee. So, for example, if, let's say you were interviewing a patient at work and you ask about their family relationships and they're like, oh, yeah, my son and I get along so well. He's so supportive. Yeah, so I'm exaggerating here, right? But clearly what the person's tone of voice isn't agreeing with what they're saying. So you can reflect in that case and say, oh, I hear you saying you get along well with your son. I also hear some hesitancy in your voice or some uncertainty. Would you like to say more about that? So that's a way to lean into those observations. Now, sometimes people want to keep things private, and if you observe something and they don't want to take it further, obviously we will respect that. But offering that initial opportunity to lean into what the person is feeling about the situation, to get at some of the deeper needs, is an important way to empathize with a person over a challenge they're having. So we talked about leaning into your observations by using reflection. Another way to lean into your observations is just to state what you see. If you observe, let's say you're a nurse leader and you're interacting with a person that you lead at work and you see they're fidgeting a lot and they just seem uncomfortable, just saying that. Say, it looks to me like you're uncomfortable. Is there something about that you'd like to talk about? Can help to, again, get at those deeper needs that we're really trying to elicit through this interviewing for empathy work. And limiting your bossiness. This is actually one of the hardest for me because in some ways, bossiness is clear. But even things like tell me more are a little more bossy than saying, would you like to tell me more? Or tell me more if you'd like. So softening your demands can be a nice way to stay focused on the other person and make sure they have a good experience through the conversation. What we're really trying to get at is people's why. Why do they feel the way they do? Why did they say what they did? Why is this a challenge for them? That elicits the deeper issues behind a challenge. But why is the most universal defensive question to ask? It's actually true in all cultures, or I've read that it's true in all cultures. Obviously, I haven't experienced that for myself in all cultures. The way you can get at the why is by asking what and how questions. So this is something you're likely already familiar with and is a little bit of a refresher. When you're asking your questions, when you do want to lean into those observations, when you do want to dig a little deeper into something someone said, using the words what and how to ask those questions can make a good experience for your interviewee and help to get at those deeper feelings without making them feel defensive. When you're trying to elicit the story, so thinking back to that arc of the interview, you want to ask some broad, open-ended questions. And again, during this empathy phase of design thinking, we're trying to diverge. There is no topic that is too broad. Now, you don't want to kind of go to the opposite extreme and talk about other things just so you don't have to talk about the problem. But the idea is to get at the broader issue, not just the specific thing you were talking about. And again, clinicians and leaders, but especially folks I've seen who are clinicians, get used to being very efficient in their questioning. And even when they ask open-ended questions, they're really there to look for a response that's in the box of what they came in to get from the conversation. And that is complete opposite in interviewing for empathy. You're really there to have the person's experience come through, and you don't know what that experience is. So you can't put that in a box walking in. You have to come in with the intent of trying to open that up as much as possible and to get those broad understanding. So when you're trying to get at the stories, asking broad, open-ended questions can be helpful. Things like the walk me through that you did in your exercise, your creativity exercise. Walk me through how you do this. Walk me through the semester. Walk me through how you designed that. Can help to get at through the steps in the way someone thought about something, which can then illustrate those deeper needs. You want to ask the clarifying questions. I want to emphasize that because we are going to be trying to make inferences onto what people say. And inferences are just that. They can be amazing at getting at a deeper need that the person maybe even hasn't recognized or articulated for themselves. But they do need to be validated, and those clarifying questions are where we validate that. You don't have to necessarily always validate that within the course of one interview. Sometimes we'll come back to someone and say, hey, after reflecting, I got the impression that this was part of the challenge. What do you think of that? And that's okay. We'll be doing some of that in the class too, and we'll talk about strategies for doing that in a way that makes sense to people. In one of the design lectures you're going to watch this week, he talks about the way that a client can mess things up with that by asking people to essentially tell them what they wanted to hear. So when you're asking these clarifying questions, you need to structure the way you ask in a way that's very open to being told what you don't want to hear. You're going to be doing many interviews in this class, so about 2 a week for the design sprint portion of the course. So asking who else you should be talking to is important, and these can be broad, like what other stakeholders are relevant here, or this can be specific, like do you have some names of people that I should talk to? Now, because I know a lot of the people in this space, I'm going to be getting you off to a good start with that, but you need to leverage and build some of your own network for interviewing. So people that might be interesting to talk to would be folks who are DNP students at other universities. As you start to understand this problem, part of looking at solutions is going to be understanding what other people do, or folks who've graduated from other doctoral programs. So think about who you can interview in your workspace or in your life that might meet those criteria or be a contributor to your understanding of this problem or the solution. And when you talk to those people, ask them, who else should I be talking to broaden out that network? And then at the end of a conversation, it can be good to ask, what you didn't ask about, just in case the person came with something they really wanted to tell you and you weren't able to touch on it yet. I'm going to briefly show you this empathy map. We'll be learning more about this moving forward, but I want you to kind of have some knowledge about where we're heading. Once you are finished with your interviews, and not this first week, but next week, we're going to use an empathy map to organize those data. And an empathy map is where you put into these boxes what the person said, what they did, what they thought, and what they felt. What they say and do, the saying is what they said, and you want to pick the things that you think are most relevant here, or even those extremes could go here. What they do are those observations you made throughout the interview. And then thinking and feeling are your inferences, so what you're inferring about what they said and what they did. And again, we're going to circle back and validate some of the what they think and what they feel later, not maybe with that person or maybe with the group, because we're really trying to design for a whole group here. So again, you don't have to do anything with this week. I just wanted to prime you to show you what it is. All right, well, I hope you have a lot of fun in your interviews, getting to know folks and enjoying hearing a little bit about the challenge they're experiencing.